worthwhile, and they did not go with that demand. And yet, the United States government now officially, by the two parties, supporting the idea of supporting Israel as a Jewish state. I mean, the connotation of that are unprecedented, what it means. I mean, forget about the notion of supporting a state in any religious identity, be it Islamic, be it Christian, or being Jewish. I mean, you have to contemplate the political and human connotations of a promise or a pledge like that. I mean, what it means is that America supports Israel always remaining as a majority Jewish state. That's what it means. But nobody has ever asked Bush or Obama the implications. So if the demographic balance continues to tip gradually in favor of the Palestinians, does it come to a point when additional birth of Palestinian children would be eliminated in order to maintain Jewish majority state? Like, would there come a state that every additional Palestinian baby that could tip the balance in favor of the Palestinians would be tossed across a fence or the border to maintain the... I mean, that would be the only way. I mean, basically, it's a promise to use all means necessary in order to maintain the Jewishness of the state. 7, to present Iraq as an exemplary model of democracy. I mean, you have to go back to that promise, because now it's laughable. The United States was not promising to make Iraq as a democracy. The United States was promising to make Iraq as an exemplary democracy for the entire region to emulate. I mean, this is like a version of the domino theory of Vietnam in reverse. The United States was arguing, I mean, this is Paul Wolfowitz and others, that the United States is going to create a democracy going to be so appealing, so exemplary, that the entire Middle East region is going to rush to try to emulate the model that was created in Iraq. Now, this is the declared Bush doctrine, the items that are of interest to us in terms of assessing its impact on the Middle East. Let's look at the actual record of the Bush doctrine. First, I think the actual record was wars are necessary for American global hegemony or for revenge. The United States, I mean, I am not somebody who focuses on oil as a determinant or exclusive determinant of America's policies and for the invasion of Iraq. I am of the opinion, especially with the Bush administration, that it was so much about global hegemony, so much about trying to discipline the very few dissenting states around the world. I mean, it is very interesting how much ink is spilled in Western media about Venezuela, Iran, and Syria. I mean, certainly not from the standpoint of human rights and democracy. I mean, certainly it's not. Because there is a much larger community of dictatorships within the camp of America's client states in the Middle East: Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Jordan. I mean, the list is so long, even if you don't want to touch Israel, which we should. You will find that it's certainly not about human rights and democracy. It's just about dissent. And this is why dictatorships can cease to be dictatorships only by switching their attitudes to the United States and by opening their markets to U.S. capital, to influx of American capital. I mean, the best example in that regard is Libya. I mean, somebody should bother to look at the New York Times and the various United States newspapers to see how references to the Libyan dictator changed by virtue of his shifting of his foreign policy. I mean, Libyan leader was characteristically described as Libya's dictator when he was opposed to his foreign policy. After he abandoned his search for weapons of mass destruction, and after he opened up his weapon system to the United States and so on, after he paid the amount of money as if you can compensate for the deaths of students that he killed on Pan Am 103, and after he allowed American multinational corporations to go into Libya, basically the references to him became suddenly respectful. He became Libya's leader. Or sometimes when they go nasty, they would say Libya's strong man, but not the dictator. This is similar, by the way, in Iraq, if you see the references after his invasion of Kuwait. So it is very clear that the United States decided that wars are important not in order to overthrow a regime, but also to punish enemies. I mean, remember, Iraq was an end in itself, but also a symbol that would make other wars unnecessary. Meaning, The United States calculated, according to the expert advice that was given to them by their own chosen Middle Eastern experts, Fuad Ajami, Bernard Lewis, and so on, that Syria and Iran would be so intimidated after what that happens that they would basically surrender to the United States. And of course, this was done at least on 2 counts. The first one is obvious. And the second one, you basically gave every reason to Iran and Syria to sabotage America's occupation of Iraq, which is exactly what they did. Second, far from the freedom of agenda, it is fair to say that the United States consolidated the alliance of pro-American client dictatorships in the Middle East region. There is absolutely no evidence that the United States pushed for any democratization of any of the countries in which we speak. If anything, it can be easily argued, as a human rights report by Amnesty International argued, that the war on terrorism gave impetus to many Arab dictatorships and others to fight their own dissidents, some of whom are liberals, not fundamentalists, and to torture them and to arrest them and put them for longer times without trial in the name of fighting terrorism. And this is why it became quite common and frequent by Arab dictatorships to invent a diabolical Al-Qaeda plot when it existed or did not exist in order to get American support and in order to get American justification of violations of human rights in Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, or any of those countries. In fact, you will find that a country like Jordan, which suddenly after the war on terrorism was declared, was getting something like $1 billion a year, up from 100 million a year before that, the Jordanian felt it necessary every few weeks to declare that they cracked another plot by Al-Qaeda to pump this target or not, and yet little evidence is ever shown about such attempts. I think it's fair to say that the freedom of agenda was intended largely for American domestic purposes. The American public was being told that the purposes of America's use of force, it's like war for peace, or dictatorship for democracy. One of those Orwellian formulas that they came up with. So we are invading countries and killing the population, dropping large number of bombs and rockets on them, but all that in order to spread and push the freedom of agenda, which sounded very good. And yet, it's very good to measure America's attitude to democracy and human rights by measuring its attitude to the most oppressive, most intolerant state in the Middle East and beyond, Saudi Arabia. Here is a state that is founded on institutionalized anti-Semitism, anti-other, misogyny throughout the world. There is no state like it. This is a state that has been responsible for the propagation of literature of hate against Christians, against Jews, against other Sunnis, against Shiites, against leftists, communists. If you want to lament the decline of the left, as I do on a daily basis, in the Middle East, or beyond, I would say that this is largely the work of Saudi Arabia, which basically created an international fundamentalist fanatical movement that was aimed at hitting at communism around the world. And of course you can read about Saudi investment for reactionary movements throughout Africa to fight communism, along with the United States. And from that international movement came Al-Qaeda and the like. But I totally see that it would be very unfair to pin the entire blame on Saudi Arabia for those movements. I would say that Saudi Arabia did that in total coordination and under the sponsorship of the United States during the Cold War. This was their declared America's purposes. Thirdly, I think that the actual record of the Bush Doctrine was that the global war to assert U.S. will, impose its will, economical will and political will, and ostensibly to stem out Al-Qaeda's presence. But it has been shown in many critiques that Al-Qaeda, if it was weakened in some places, it may have been strengthened and created in other places. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It came after America's invasion. Even if Al-Qaeda has been weak in other places. And there are people like me who argue, along with Olivier Roy in a book he wrote in the 1990s, about the failure of political Islam. I mean, you can look at Al-Qaeda's horrendous, horrific work, terrorist deeds as a sign of their failure.